On the afternoon of 2nd September 1933, a trainman was making his usual way through a carriage after all the passengers have left. And as he was coming through the aisles, making sure that nobody was still left aboard, he spotted an abandoned suitcase. He went over to it and tried picking it up, but he quickly realized it was very heavy. When he would finally open it up, what he discovered inside would haunt him for the rest of his days. And the contents of the suitcase would continue to make headlines well past the millennium. Please know that I will be showing you some very sensitive images, and so viewer discretion is strongly advised. But before we get started, my name is Andrea Scott, and if you like scary stories based on true events, then please do stick around because that's what I do and I'm uploading weekly. Now, turn your extra lemons into a lemonade and let's get started with episode 4. In 1911, in the Slovakian part of the Czechoslovakia, a baby girl was born into a very poor family. She was named Otylie, and she was one of the 5 children the parents would eventually have. The family would often struggle financially because Otylie's father did not really hold a steady job, and so they had to make do with very little, and sometimes they would even go days without being properly fed. This, of course, meant that the children didn't really have any role models in their lives and would often get into trouble. Particularly Otylie, who at the age of 11 decided to run away and start a new life of her own. Of course, because she didn't really have any means to live by, she would often have to resort in stealing, and she was sort of just roaming from place to place. And this would result in her spending 3 years in reformatory. Early in 1933, Otylie, who was just 22 years old at the time, decided that she wanted to start afresh, and so she moved into the capital city, Prague. She thought the bigger city would bring her more opportunities, she would get a proper job and start her new life. But she wasn't really managing to hold a position for longer periods of time. And because she didn't really have any savings or really many friends, she had to come up with another solution how to pay for rent and for food. And so she went on to become a prostitute. However, Otylie did try very hard, but she wasn't really being liked by the other women. They thought that she was being very naive and she didn't really know how the life worked in a bigger city. But Otylie paid them no mind, and she just continued to do whatever she needed to do to survive yet another day. Soon enough, Otylie would find a small apartment to rent. And even though this wasn't very much, to Otylie it meant everything. Now she finally could have a home and she could return there at the end of every day. And so over the next couple of months, Otylie found herself in more or less the same routine every day. She would wake up quite late in the morning, she would have a bit of a breakfast, then she would go and meet one of her friends to walk around the city, and then in the evening she would usually have a meal at her landlady's, and then she would go on to meet one of her clients. Otylie would often come back to her place very late at night, which her landlady really didn't like. She did ask Otylie to try and change her behavior, but Otylie paid her no mind and she continued to do whatever she wanted. And so in the late afternoon of the 31st of August 1933, Otylie was getting ready to go out later on that evening. She would do her hair in a very signature look that she perfected by then. And it was one of those, sleek 1920 curls that a lot of the movie stars were wearing. And she put on her favorite dress and a pair of heels, and she left her apartment at around 6 o'clock. Otylie went first to her landlady's place. There she had a small dinner, and the landlady was reminding her that, her rent was due up again. And again, she was asking her, please don't come back home so late. Something could happen to you. I just don't want this kind of behavior in my house. But Otylie said to her, look, you don't need to worry. I'm actually going to meet a man tonight, and I know that he's about to propose to me. And he also wants to fix me up with a job in a local laundry. And the landlady, when she heard it, she was so happy for Otylie, and she really thought that, maybe this could be the start of something new and exciting for her. And so when Otylie finished her meal, she thanked the landlady and she left the place. She was going to meet a friend before she went on to meet that gentleman. And so for the next hour or so, herself and her former flatmate, Božena Velingerová, would just walk around the city and they were catching up. At around 8 p.m, Otylie would say goodbye to her friend, and she went on to meet the man whom she thought that, maybe could be the ticket out of her miserable life she was currently living. However, when she arrived at the meeting point, her date, Józef Piękny, was already there, but he was accompanied by another woman. Józef, who was working as a technical surgeon at the nearby military station, was standing there with another prostitute named Antonie Koklesova. Otylie actually knew Antonie from way before, when the two women were still living in the Slovakian part of the Czechoslovakia. And finding Antonie there obviously did not make Otylie happy at all. Soon enough, the trio would be caught up in an argument, because clearly Otylie had different ideas as to how she wanted the night to go. Ultimately, the situation would calm down a bit, and they actually decided to go to the nearby pub to have a bite to eat and to share a few drinks. It was getting pretty late at this point, and Otylie, who was now a little bit tipsy, she confessed to the two that, she couldn't really go back home now, because her landlady, she would be angry with her again. And so Antonie, she offered Otylie if she wanted to go back to her place and spend the night there. Otylie did refuse this offer, however, and she went on to explain that actually she has a friend that works in a nearby pub, and she's sure that he's going to allow her to stay at his that night. And so they finished their drinks, and at around 11 p.m, Józef and Antonie would leave Otylie behind and they would go back to his place. So she decided that she would go over to the nearby cafe and ask her friend if she can stay over that night. But when she got there, it would turn out that he was still working and would be for the remainder of the night, but Otylie would not remain on her own for much longer. Just before midnight, she was spotted entering another bar in the company of a younger looking man with a short curly blonde hair. There they quickly crossed towards the table, which was at the very end of the pub, and they ordered some wine and an apple for Otylie. And so the pair chatted for a bit, and generally they seemed to have a really good time. And eventually the pair would also leave together. In the late afternoon of September the 2nd, 1933, so 2 days after when Otylie was seen with this blonde man, a young student was traveling on a train as he was returning to his college in Bratislava for the start of a new year. He was sitting alone when all of a sudden an older looking gentleman came into his cabin. He sort of shuffled his way in, because he was traveling with this large suitcase. And when he entered the cabin, he would immediately go over to the spare seat and he would lift the suitcase and put it onto the rail that was above the seat. And when he was done with that, without saying a word, he just left the cabin. The student, who was still sitting there watching this man struggle with this very heavy suitcase, thought that, this was very strange. But then he thought maybe the gentleman needed to use the bathroom, and I'm sure that once he's finished, he will return and all will be fine. However, that man did not return for the remainder of the journey. But again, the student remained calm about the situation, because he thought that, that if the gentleman is not traveling with the suitcase, maybe he's sending it to the next train station where someone else will hop on and they will collect it and they will go off. But the student did think that it was a little bit strange that the man didn't even speak to him. But again, it wasn't really his business, so he just let it go. And once they reached the final destination, the student just grabbed his bag and looked at the suitcase once again, just shrugged his shoulders and walked off. As this was the train's last stop, it would be eventually swept by a trainman, just to make sure that nobody was left aboard and that all the luggages were collected and nothing was left behind. And so the trainman begins his journey, and he politely tells a couple of people that were still on board just to leave, because the train was going to be soon returning to its original station. And eventually he enters the cabin of where the student was traveling, and he sees the luggage that was left behind. And so he looks around, just in case the owner is somewhere nearby. But then he thinks to himself, I've just walked through the entire train. And because this cabin is practically the last one, I would have seen them by now. And so the trainman reaches for the luggage, but he soon realizes that it is very heavy. And so he steps onto the seat that is directly underneath it, and he reaches for the luggage with both of his hands. And with a great struggle, he brings it down to the ground. There he picks it up, and he carries it out of the train to the nearby Lost and Found office. When he enters the Lost and Found office, He first logs it with the receptionist, and then he brings it back to the back office to show it to one of his colleagues. And then they even have a little joke about it and say, if it's so heavy, maybe there's gold in it, so we should definitely open it. The luggage, however, was not locked. It was only bound by a big black leather belt. And so over time, the two trainmen decided to open it up and look at what was inside of it. Little did they know that approximately at the same time, 400 kilometers far away, in town called Košice, another very similar luggage was also found. And just like this one, that the two were now staring into with a pure horror in their eyes, was also very heavy and bound with the same black leather belt. Now, if you're still watching this, I wanted to ask if you would consider subscribing to my channel. Not only does it really motivate me to create more videos, but it also shows me that there are people out there who really want to see my content. And a lot of work goes into making each of my episodes, so your support will be very welcome. Now let's go back into our story. The two suitcases held the remains of a woman's body that was cut up into several parts. The luggage that ended up in Bratislava with those two trainmen contained the woman's head and her two legs. The luggage that ended up in Košice held her torso with her arms still attached. The autopsy showed that the woman had been struck into her head twice with a large and sharp object, such as a meat cleaver. Both cuts were about 6 centimeters deep, and they would have hit her brain, which would make her lose consciousness. After this, the attacker would have grabbed a cleaver again, and with 2 strikes would have beheaded the still breathing woman. There were traces of blood found in her lungs, which only could have been inhaled if she was still alive at the time. Her killer then raised a knife and stabbed her 7 times into her left breast. He then proceeded to remove both of her legs, and he cut them off just below her groin. And for the legs to be able to fit into the suitcase, he even slashed the kneecaps so that he would be able to bend them. There were traces of an apple found in the woman's stomach, and so this was the indication that she had died approximately between 1 and 3 o'clock of the morning of the 1st of September. There were also some loose threads found across her body because the killer had tried washing her. This suggested that she had actually been murdered in someone's home, which was potentially a very important piece of information because at the time there were not that many flats that had a walk-in bathroom within them. The police would also find several other items in those 2 luggages, such as several paper clippings and a woman's pair of underwear and a man's pair of shorts. But unfortunately, even with all of this evidence collected, no fingerprints were ever found. And so the investigation would begin. There was very little the police could be working with because they didn't know the identity of the woman or who could have killed her. And so they thoroughly washed the body, they photographed her, and they released the pictures to the public in a hope that someone will come forward and identify her. Both of the suitcases, with whatever had been found inside them, were put on a display in a nearby police station. And again, police were really hoping that someone will identify those items, and potentially the owner as well. On the 6th of September, so 4 days after the body had been found, the victim was finally identified as Otylie by her own sister. However, nobody could have provided any information as to whom the killer might have been. The police spoke to the press, and together they released false information. So when the intel was coming back in, they could easily tell who was telling the truth and who was lying. But even after the 700 or so letters they received, none of them provided any clues or ideas as to whom the person might have been. However, the police kept getting notified about one particular type of letter that was being delivered to a small local newspaper almost every week. These letters were signed by the so-called Phantom of the Street, aka Karel XY, and this person was claiming that he was the killer of Otylie. He went on to describe how the pair had met on the evening of the 1st of September, and after a brief chat, Karel had allegedly asked Otylie to come back to his apartment where they wanted to have sex. However, when they got there, Karel would find out that Otylie was actually a prostitute and she wanted to be paid for her services. And so this made Karel very angry because he had been allegedly hurt by a prostitute before. And so he decided to stun her, and he began removing her body parts according to a diagram of a human body that he kept at his apartment. He would then place the remains into 2 suitcases, and he would drive them off to 2 separate train stations. At the time, Otylie's line of work was not disclosed to the public yet, and so Karel became quickly the #1 suspect. He also went on to say that he had killed another prostitute, whose murder investigation was still ongoing. In his letters, he noted that he wished to continue with his killings because it brought him some sort of a pleasure. He claimed that he was a very wealthy man, descended from a noble family, he was well traveled, and that he could speak English very well. However, from the sample letter we have, it is quite obvious that he was definitely not a native speaker and he was more of a beginner. And even though he handed some of these letters himself at the local newspaper, his identity remained a mystery, and he was never found. The letters would abruptly stop in October 1933. The reason for this could be the fact that in many of them before, Karel went on to say that he actually didn't want to live anymore and that he wanted to commit suicide. And so that the reason why the letters would have stopped could be the reason that Karel actually ended up taking his own life. And that could be why he was never captured. Otylie would be classed as yet another murder that happened between 1926 and 1938. The police thought that all these women that were murdered back then could have been linked to the same killer. Most of them were prostitutes and of Slovak origin, and some of the ways in which they had been killed would more or less match. However, the police would never find a concrete piece of evidence that all these murders were linked together, and we still, to date, do not know who the killer or killers were. And even though the police would continue to get letters up until 1966, eventually the case would go cold. The sergeant, as well as the other prostitute that Otylie met the night of her murder, they both provided an alibi for each other. The sergeant also then rejected any claims of him ever intending to propose to Otylie, or that he wanted to find her a job at the nearby laundry. The young barman whom Otylie wanted to spend the night with instead did have an alibi for the entirety of his night, and he would also then go on to say that the two actually weren't that close and that he was not going to allow her to spend the night at his anyway. The young man with the curly short hair Otylie was spotted with last, as well as the older man who had left the luggage at the train, have never been identified. It wasn't until 2017 when DNA samples were obtained from the descendants of the 2 top suspects, the sergeant and the prostitute. However, these samples still did not provide any conclusive information. And in March 2021, even after the coronavirus epidemic, the director of the Czech Police Museum confirmed that there were still no results of the analysis. In February 2023, Detective Lottes, who is in charge of old cases that are still unsolved, added that the DNA samples collected back in 1933 were still being held under a tight lock. And so far, these samples have not been made available for a comparison of the samples that were collected in 2017. Another possible reason for this process taking such a long time is the way that this sort of a backtracking of the DNA being obtained through other family members is viewed as highly unethical. And so we might never get to know if a match is found and whom it might be possibly be linking to. And so this brings us to the end of our story. It is a particularly upsetting one because we still don't know who killed Otylie. And I'm very doubtful that even if the comparison does happen, which is now looking very unlikely, I still feel like the public would not be notified of who might killed her. This is one of the most well-known murders in the Czech Republic, and everyone has been talking about it for years. It has even provided inspiration for several TV shows and documentaries, and I'm so glad that now I finally got a chance to retell it myself. So, do you think the killer will be ever identified? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time.